Greetings, everyone. My name is Jason Meyer with the Rocky Mountain Institute. We'll be starting our webinar shortly. We're going to be waiting 2 more minutes for the remaining folks to jump on the line, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're glad you can join us for the next hour. My name is Lauren Schweisberg, and I'm a fellow with our Electricity Innovation Lab, better known as eLab, here at Rocky Mountain Institute. I'm joined today by my colleagues Karina Chan, a principal with eLab. Hi there. And Jason Meyer, a manager with eLab.
Hello.
We work on a part of eLab called eLab Leap, and we will be hosting today's discussion. Before I begin, just want to provide some housekeeping items up front. Listeners will be placed on mute for the duration of the webinar to avoid any audio interference. Please submit questions to our team through the questions window in your webinar interface. We will have time at the end of today's webinar for a moderated Q&A, and we'll be compiling questions throughout the webinar to address at that time. So please feel free to provide us your questions on a rolling basis.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. First, we wanted to provide just a little bit of information about eLab to set the stage before we jump into the content. Since its introduction 4 years ago, RMI's Electricity Innovation Lab has been dedicated to helping transition the electricity sector in the U.S. to one that is more clean, efficient, and resilient. eLab engages a diverse cross-section of stakeholders and perspectives from across the electricity sector. Those include regulators, grid operators, environmental NGOs, consumer advocates, electric utilities, customers, investors, renewable, grid, and distributed resource providers, quite a number of folks. We work with the network members to move new ideas from conception into demonstration and then on to scale through the industry. eLab operates under the following guiding questions. You'll see the 3 on the screen. The first one, how can we understand and effectively communicate the costs and benefits of distributed resources as a part of the electricity system? The next guiding question for eLab, how can we harmonize regulatory frameworks, pricing structures, and business models of utilities and distributed resource developers for the greatest benefit to customers and society as a whole? And the final guiding question, how can we accelerate the pace of economic distributed resource adoption? In addition to eLab, I wanted to provide some context on the program that all 3 of us here are members of, eLab Leap, which is an initiative of eLab. Our goal with eLab Leap is to support collaboration and solutions that empower and improve the lives of low-income households and communities in a clean energy future. Within eLab Leap, we have 2 primary work streams. The first one is a social change lab, which we convene in the state of New York. It includes a range of key stakeholders from across the state and supports their capacity to develop new relationships and to work together in new ways. In our lab, we work with approximately 40 individuals in government, utilities, community-based orgs, advocates, financiers, service providers, others representing low-income families and communities. And then our second primary work stream within eLab Leap is to support the emergence of new business models to serve this sector. This includes doing research to inform the energy industry and stimulate dialogue about market opportunities that can benefit low-income communities. It also includes working with individual teams through the nation who are developing these models to help them solve the challenges they face. Today's webinar falls within this second work stream focused on business models. It is about how clean energy business models are evolving to serve low-income customers, which to date have not had many affordable clean energy options.
Thanks, Jason. Our goals today are to introduce you to several of the models that we've identified and researched to date, and to provide a framework for thinking about how these models are working to deliver clean energy benefits to low-income customers. In October, we moderated a webinar with guest speakers who are each personally working on these models to hear in their words what challenges they face and also what successes they've had. But we received requests to also host a webinar that provides more of a tutorial or a Cliff Notes version on how the models themselves are functioning. So that's how we've tuned our agenda for this afternoon. Here's how we'd like to spend our time together. First, we'll introduce what we mean by business model. We're going to establish some common language and explain the framework that we're using for understanding and talking about these models. Next, we're going to unpack how this framework applies to 8 specific models we've researched. We're not going to have a time to do a deep dive on each model, but we'll provide specific examples that we think are helpful. We'll conclude with a few observations and insights we've gleaned from this work to date and share with you some of the top questions that we have moving forward. Finally, as we've mentioned, we'll have some time to answer your questions as well at the end of today's webinar.
Thanks, Lauren. So what do we mean when we say business model? Well, there are many different ways that people are using that phrase today. And to understand the way we're using it on this webinar, it will be helpful perhaps to understand the way we're thinking about other terms first, like technologies and mechanism. So when we say technology, we mean the software or the hardware that helps provide clean energy value for end users. This could be solar panels, it could be storage components, electric vehicles, so on and so forth. When we say mechanism, we're referring to those enabling financial and policy tools that are helping to unlock access to technology. So examples of mechanisms could include PACE loans. They could include government incentives like SASH or MASH that are helping to fund solar in California today, or tax credits. And what many people working in this low-income sector will tell you, folks that we have on the phone today, is that making the technology and establishing mechanisms alone isn't ensuring high uptake and participation by end users. Just because you establish an on-bill payment program doesn't mean that automatically people will enroll and begin to experience benefits. And what's needed to ensure that uptake is what we are calling full delivery models, so another phrase, and full delivery models that connect technology and mechanisms to customers. A delivery model is a plan for that full chain of transactions between stakeholders that includes ongoing funding and financing, ongoing service delivery, how those technologies are delivered to end users, and ongoing customer engagement and acquisition. There could be more to full delivery models and these 3 components. We could talk about those in a future date, but these are the 3 places we're using as a starting point because they're the places where we're seeing innovation occur to take, the first models that we've seen that are, serving higher earning customers at scale and evolving and modifying them to serve low-income customers. So we define these 3 components a little better too, I think, for our listeners. So by funding and incentives, we mean where does this model get its money for upfront capital and continued operation? What does that capital stack look like? How do utility and government incentives play a role? How does the model redistribute risk or enable additional investment? What are the legal or financial structures that are needed to require these things to work? And we'll discuss these approaches in more detail. By service delivery, we're referring to the nuts and bolts of the operation. How does the model procure materials, install technologies, deliver clean energy benefits, and sort of tactical, how does it build consumers for services provided? And then on the customer engagement acquisition, by this we mean the process of recruiting and managing customers. This encompasses marketing, education and outreach, subscription, even aggregating customers. Now, to date, most of the models we've concentrated on are what we call enterprise or business models, models that are for-profit endeavors. And they're recognizing that the low-income sector is a significant market sector, and they're engaging private capital with a goal of generating returns as well as impact. And that's where we focused. In this webinar, we will also be including Grid Alternatives as one of our models for discussion. Grid is a nonprofit primarily funded by donors and state incentives. This model is not a commercial endeavor, the one that we'll be discussing. It's an example of what we're calling an assistance model. And ultimately, both enterprise and assistance models, or business and assistance models, are important for scaling clean energy benefits to low-income customers. Now, on our end, we get connected to people who are working on low-income business models primarily through our eLab network and through word of mouth. And we have firsthand conversations with these champions, and then through our research, we sit down on paper and we try to at least explain the exact ways the models are functioning and their components so we can share that with the broader industry who are trying to do similar work. We and eLab do not advocate or endorse any specific model. our goal is to understand them and frame more broadly how these models are evolving to meet needs. Oftentimes, we'll do this in the form of a diagram. We'll depict and we'll draw who is involved in the model and the services and money that flow between them to enable it all to work. And some of you have seen a number of our diagrams in our first Insight Brief Breaking Ground, and we're making more. As we continue to do this research, we're templatizing more and more how we format the diagrams so they're easier to read because they can get complicated. So for example, we will call out the entity or entities who are acting as the main champion or coordinator in each model, in this one case, Posigen. We'll also depict funding, incentives, and other financing actors in one column. In another column, the main service delivery actors who deploy the technology and services. And finally, a column to depict the various customers, the end users themselves, who are the beneficiaries.
Great, thanks, Karina. Now that we've done some level setting around what we mean by business model and the framework we use to understand them, we're now going to turn to some of the specific models we've researched. We have to say there are a number of exciting models emerging to provide efficiency, renewables, storage, EVs, and access to other clean technologies and benefits. In this webinar, we're primarily focusing on findings from interviews we've conducted with 8 models. It would take too long to describe the specifics of how each model works, but we're going to provide an overview of each. And then we're going to provide our insights by referring to specific innovations in the particular models that we think are important to understand. To be clear, many models include multiple innovations, some of which are common to all and some of which are unique. Just a note, if you want to learn more about each model, we'll be publishing more detailed explanations and a package of corresponding diagrams for download on our website in coming weeks. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to meet these models in terms of the societal unit at which it serves the customer. And by this we mean single-family homes, multifamily buildings, communities, and utility districts. So first, we're going to talk about the 2 models that reach low-income households at the single-family home. Our first model, Posigen, is a company that provides solar and energy efficiency services to low to moderate income single-family homes in Louisiana, Connecticut, and New York. Customers lease both solar and solar PV systems and finance efficiency measures from Posigen via a 0% APR credit agreement, which ultimately reduces family monthly energy costs. Posigen drives down costs for its customers by standardizing design, streamlining installation, using referrals to acquire customers, and leveraging the overall economies of scale that they gain from serving multiple households. Grid Alternatives is an assistance model that provides solar to low-income households at no or low cost to families. Grid Alternatives is expanding the types of offerings they provide, which we'll get into more later, but by and large to date, the greatest number of customers they've served is through their single-family model. They use a combination of government funding, donor funding, and donated materials to be able to offer solar for free, and the household typically owns the solar. An important goal for Grid is to provide local workforce training on their projects. Next, we're going to talk about models that reach many families at once at the unit of the multifamily building. First, the building co-op model this is being championed by Brooklyn Power. This model deploys rooftop solar by working with existing building co-ops like those in New York, buildings where the households own total shares of building assets. The building co-op, rather than individual households, is the entity that borrows on a line of credit and pays for upfront costs and owns the solar array. Then the tax benefits and other benefits are just distributed to all co-op members in proportion to their ownership share in the co-op. Next, we have the tenant load flex model. This model is currently in development in France, but relevant to situations in the US as well. It works with the Housing Authority building portfolio owners as a touch point to access their hundreds of tenants. These tenants are recruited to participate in demand response programs in exchange for lower heating rates. This becomes really valuable when you have hundreds or thousands of participating households. Zooming out a little broader are models that serve households across entire communities, often but not always through assets that are located off-site. So first we have the worker co-op model, which is being championed by Rockspot. This is an example of co-owned community solar, and the community-based nonprofit Rockspot in Rochester, New York is driving this model. This model drives down costs by using community sweat equity and existing social networks to reduce costs for things like customer acquisition and site selection. In addition, anchor tenants agree to flex their energy uptake depending on how many low-income households can participate, which makes the project more attractive to investors. Participants can co-own as well as subscribe to this offsite solar. Next, co-op power, the co-op owner model. This is another community solar model where participants can co-own as well as subscribe to offsite solar. The customers of this model include anchor tenants in a range of different income families, which makes the project more attractive to investors. Finally, are models that reach customers through their utility territory, which could be a municipal utility, a co-op, or investor-owned utilities. In New Mexico, like the worker co-op in Rochester, this model also uses community resources to reduce the cost of community solar. In this model, however, the community-owned rural distribution co-op is the one taking on pieces of work, like acquiring sites and customers and driving down costs. Our Shine team at RMI has been working with both Rockspot and rural co-ops in New Mexico to help them procure community solar at lower costs. And we'll talk about that more later. Finally, the integrated utility service concept. RMI has been working with the municipal utility in Fort Collins, Colorado, on a concept where the utility itself is the core provider of efficiency and solar to its customers. Through this concept, the utility is able to champion really aggressive efficiency adoption, for example, because it's able to recoup some of that revenue. Hence the name integrated utility, where the utility is doing more than just selling electrons. Okay, now I know we're putting out some dense information. Again, we will be writing some of the stuff up in an insight brief. So for those of you who are trying to take notes as we go, this webinar is being recorded, and also there will be some written documents following. Okay, so after that overview, what we're going to do is take a deeper dive and see how the models are working in the three areas that we outlined earlier: funding, service delivery, and customer engagement. So to follow along, look at the bottom of the slides from here on out to see which of these categories we're talking about, be it funding, service delivery, or customer engagement. And as we give examples, we will first start with a little context about what's different in each category in terms of serving low-income customers and what is important to address. And then, as we provide concrete examples, we'll show model icons as a reminder of which of the 8 models we're referring to. So first, we'll start with funding and incentives. Here is a short, definitely non-comprehensive list, but important list of the unique characteristics of the low-income space that make it necessary to come up with funding innovations in the first place. So most core to the issue, low-income customers typically lack the upfront capital needed to invest in distributed energy resources. Higher income customers could take out loans to cover this cost, but lower income customers also have limited access to financial mechanisms and institutions. So traditional loan qualification methods like credit checks can render many low-income customers ineligible, and many low-income customers lack credit history, or some have poor credit history, a number do not have bank accounts. Third, financiers have traditionally perceived this customer segment as risky. And the arrangements that are evolving to serve this segment, consider them untested. And so therefore, many are less likely to offer loans. Fourth, many of today's incentives for distributed energy resources are structured around tax credits. But both low-income customers and nonprofits often don't have enough tax liability to take advantage of tax credits. On the upside, fifth, serving low-income customers also presents an opportunity to use unique state and local incentives. So while incentives play an important role in distributed energy resource adoption today, some are specifically put in place to serve low-income customers and are there as an added resource.
In the models we've researched, we see different strategies that address these unique characteristics. First, across the board, most models do not have a single funder. Instead, to address risk throughout the model, they have a diverse mix of funders in their capital stack, and each funder has a particular function. So as this example, let's look at Posigen, the company based in New Orleans, Louisiana, that provides low-cost solar leases to low-income residential customers. Here's how Posigen's capital stack looks. First, Posigen engages a traditional tax equity investor, like many models do in solar, whether or not they serve low-income customers. These tax equity investors invest in solar assets in return for the ability to claim tax credits and depreciation deductions. This transaction happens via a special purpose entity called a project company, which also leases the solar to the owner of the homes on which the solar system is installed. Posigen itself will cover the costs of remaining capital at the start of the project, and they do this through a combination of partnership and support from the following kinds of funders. First, Posigen has recruited mission-aligned private equity investors to fund company growth and operations. These are venture capitalists. They often have a social mission. They're not singularly focused on high returns. They invest in Posigen itself, not directly in the individual solar projects, but their funding enables Posigen to fund normal operations and to grow. Posigen also has partnerships, for example, with the Connecticut Green Bank, that would leverage Posigen's right to receive customer lease payments over the duration of the solar lease. So in this example, the Green Bank's commitment has allowed Posigen to significantly reduce its cost of capital for projects located in Connecticut. Now, customers make their lease payments to the project company, which distributes those lease payments to Posigen and the tax equity investor. The tax equity owner remains the primary owner of the project company for 5 years in order to fully realize the benefit of the tax credit and tax deductions. And after this initial 5-year period, the ownership of the project company flips to Posigen, and Posigen has the ability to buy out the tax equity investor's remaining interest in the project company. These three so at a level higher, these three types of money, tax equity, mission-aligned private equity, and mission-aligned debt, show up in many of the models we've looked at, and they often play similar roles, and they ultimately strengthen the financial structure of the model, lower the cost of capital, and reduce risk throughout the model. As one note on the role of green banks, in this model, the Connecticut Green Bank has provided more than just financial support as loans, and that's something green banks can do. In this case, they've increased the incentive amount for solar for low-income customers in the state. They offer assistance in publicity and marketing in Connecticut. They are working on developing financing for deeper energy retrofits for low-income households. And they're working on ways to improve credit scores for low-income customers by collecting positive payment data in this model and reporting them to banks. That diverse capital stack is essentially the first approach we want to talk about. Another way to get money and get resources to customers who are loan worthy but typically wouldn't qualify for loans is to have an established credit worthy party do the borrowing instead. Rather than have individual households seek loans directly from banks, these models leverage other entities to do the borrowing. And these entities may already exist. So Brooklyn Power, for example, they will use the existing building co-op entity structure to take out a loan. And one of the advantages of this arrangement is that building co-ops already in their existence, in their jobs, already co-manage shared assets for their residents, like the buildings and the surrounding ground, so they're already experienced to some extent. Another approach we want to talk about is finding alternate ways to monetize tax credits. So as we mentioned earlier, customers and nonprofits often do not have enough tax liability to take advantage of tax credits themselves, which can make it more difficult to establish the cost case for solar, for example. Across many of these models, champions work with tax equity investors who can use the credit. This is pretty common throughout the solar industry. We thought we'd call attention to something Brooklyn Power does that's unique here. In this case, the building co-op gives each tenant the opportunity to file for tax credits based on their ownership share. And this is typically something moderate rather than low-income families can take advantage of, but it's an interesting model. Now, most clean energy delivery models, whether for corporations or higher earning customers, make use of incentives, but there are additional incentives available in some states and some utility service territories for serving low-income customers specifically. So, for example, some of the startup costs for Co-op Power's model come from prepaid subscriptions. 20 years of prepaid subscriptions. So how do low-income customers pay for 20 years worth of prepaid subscriptions? Customers in this state, Massachusetts, can secure loans from the Massachusetts Solar Loan Program. Massachusetts offers loans for ownership of solar up to $35,000. The intent of this program is to provide loans that are cash flow positive at low interest rates to a wider range of customers than could be served by a traditional bank. In addition to that mechanism, Co-op Power model also incorporates ongoing subscriptions to engage other low-income customers. So these customers, in contrast to the prepaid customers, can still participate and benefit from solar without the commitment of a loan or a long-term lease. A final point we wanted to make within the category of funding and incentives is the growing role of impact investors. Broadly speaking, impact investors are investors who seek beneficial social and environmental impacts in addition to financial returns. To date, the majority of impact investors who have participated in low-income models have been accredited investors, high net worth individuals, or institutional investors. But recent regulatory developments such as the Jobs Act now makes it legally possible for startups and later stage pre-IPO companies to use online crowd investment platforms to raise as much as $50 million from both accredited and non-accredited investors. What's exciting about this is that effectively expands the pool of eligible lenders and equity investors to include the general public. None of the 8 models we profiled taps into this sort of crowdfunding yet, but we thought it was worth mentioning since it represents the very extreme end of diversifying the capital stack. When we are thinking about this, we see this as an exciting opportunity to fund one or more pieces of models, so portions of models that might represent higher risks or uncertainty, and provide returns to people like you and me and others who are online themselves individually who may be interested in pooling our resources to test concepts that would otherwise be seen as too unconventional for other investors to take on. So we may be satisfied with smaller returns, we may be willing to take on higher risks, or we could be excited to fund a starter pilot with costs that would typically be too small to capture the interest of larger investors, but that are critical pilot projects that represent proof of concepts that attract next stage conventional lenders.
Great, thank you, Karina. Now we'd like to transition to the service delivery category to continue to explore some of these elements. Through our research, we've been seeing many different ways that these models are delivering distributed energy resources to low-income customers. And again, similar to funding and incentive, this isn't an exhaustive list, but there are several unique characteristics that we've observed at play in the low-income context. For example, a common need, charging low-income customers lower prices. It really means that enterprise models in particular have to think seriously and creatively about lowering their own costs of delivery, potentially for both hard and soft costs. Another example, there are many low-income customers living in multifamily buildings, and this can complicate delivery because of some of the well-known barriers you may be familiar with, things like split incentives between renters and building owners, lack of shared space for clean energy assets, stringent, perhaps complicated zoning restrictions, and complexity in things like metering and accounting at the tenant unit level. Finally, another example, there's also, and really interesting, there's also a growing desire for clean energy solutions to deliver more than just lower costs for low-income customers. This is something, perhaps a general expectation around the transition to a clean energy economy at a broader level. Households and communities are seeking health benefits, increased local jobs, greater local economic vibrancy. They want to be heard and have their voice in their energy options. So the first area to explore is standardization. We see some models are bringing down costs for customers by standardizing their offerings, and this can in turn enable things like bulk purchasing and faster installation. Posigen, the solar leasing company, takes standardization seriously in its solar offerings. All of their customers receive the same 4.5 kilowatt, 6.1 kilowatt, or even 8.4 kilowatt solar system. Similar system sizes may change over time, particularly as panels become cheaper and more efficient, but Posigen's bulk purchasing of most panels from the same provider. The racking and panel design is the same. Their installers become efficient experts with those standard panels and components. On the efficiency side, Posigen's upgrades are based on audits they perform in each home, and while some measures are common, they're not necessarily predetermined. Posigen's goal is to perform the audit and the energy upgrades on the same day, and this makes efficiency a lot more attractive to customers. For example, they might only have to take one day off of work, and it's a lot cheaper for Posigen since they only have to send one truck per household. Another example, the integrated utility services concept takes a menu-based approach to decision-making, really streamlining the efficiency packages that single-family households can choose from using a good, better, best rating system that reduces hassle for customers as they choose measures. Finally, another area to explore within service delivery, community leverage. Really, if you start breaking apart the entire value chain in business models, there are a myriad of places you can look to reduce costs. And take community solar, for instance, the value chain isn't solely in the purview of the solar developer. Rather, there are ways that buyers can contribute, developers can contribute, and both can potentially work together to reduce soft and hard costs. Lauren mentioned RMI Shine team, which have been working with various communities throughout the U.S. to identify when and where buyers and developers can pitch in to reduce total cost of procurement. In Rochester, Rockspot is the entity who is championing those actions buyers can take to reduce costs. In New Mexico, that role is played by the Rural Electric Co-op. In the financial model Shine is developing for New Mexico, if the rural co-op is able to exercise all the measures it can take to reduce costs, which include things like site donation, interconnection, property tax waivers, site maintenance, the cost of the resulting solar PPA could be greater than 20% cheaper than business as usual. Just a note, we've included a link at the bottom of the slide here if you're interested in further checking out Shine's publication about this opportunity. Finally, for service delivery, it is critical to move beyond just cost reduction and onto realizing the additional benefits that a future clean energy economy may unlock. In our observation, cheaper or break-even energy is not always enough, especially given the context of things like marginalization, lack of economic opportunity, social justice, and equity concerns that many low-income households and communities experience. There are a number of these benefits that a model may endeavor to deliver. Grid is a great example of this. They pair workforce development with solar install. And while they've scaled, workforce development has remained central to their model. Almost all installs are performed by local volunteers or workforce trainees, and subcontracted jobs require hiring workforce trainees as part of the arrangement. Grid also does a lot of outreach and education in the communities where solar is not common and refers people to energy efficiency resources. In the Rockspot model, Rockspot also trains local community members, and in this case, in the long term, as we've mentioned before, local community involvement is meant to lower total costs for the solar co-op members.
Thanks, Jason. That's a lot about service delivery, and we're going to move on to our final category of the innovations we're seeing, and that's customer engagement and acquisition. Customer acquisition is a really significant driver of cost in the residential solar industry. It's about 30 or 40 cents per watt, which actually is the second largest cost per watt after the module itself. There are additional characteristics to the low-income market that are as critical as they are unique. So first, there's a general wariness that predatory practices may be associated with these low-income market-based approaches, such as payday loan businesses. So this is compounded by the some negative experiences with energy businesses. We've observed this in our social change lab, where specific negative experiences with ESCOs in New York have actually eroded broader general trust. There's a common myth that clean energy, particularly solar, is unaffordable or only for gated communities and the well-off. This pervasive belief precludes many stakeholders from even considering low-income customers being served with renewables. Credit checks are the industry default way to screen customers. There's no infrastructure in place to readily evaluate customers by other means. So while many worthy customers potentially exist, it can be really difficult to quickly identify and aggregate customers who can participate. On the upside, there are strong networks of more informal community-focused organizations such as foundations, community-based organizations, nonprofits, housing providers that are really active and closely aligned with this community. So we've seen many of these models implement some really effective approaches to customer acquisition. The first one is working with a trusted aggregating entity to acquire customers. Rockspot and Grid, for example, rely on close community ties and connections with community-based organizations to acquire and aggregate customers. They're deeply connected to the community. They attend lots of events and develop relationships in order to ensure that their message is getting out to customers through people that the community trusts. Another example, working through buildings or portfolio owners can be an effective way to reduce the number of decision makers and reduce the number of contracts, which can lower the administrative burden for a developer of these projects. In the co-op building model, the multifamily building itself is used to aggregate customers, and the tenant load flex model that we described relies on a portfolio, which are connected by a housing authority. The next approach we've seen is models working with the utility itself to leverage the utility's unparalleled access to customers. We see this in the integrated utility services concept in Fort Collins. In reality, much of the administration and coordination of efficiency and solar measures in this model are done by a subcontractor, but in the Fort Collins pilot of this model, the municipal utility actually is providing the official advertising and correspondence to enroll the customers. This can also be seen in the New Mexico co-op model, which is also set up to distribute benefits to all of their existing members. A related tactic, though not used in our models, we introduce you to here is for utilities and CCAs to deploy opt-out rather than opt-in programs to customers. We've seen the lowest participation rates for utility opt-out programs that offer a renewable energy component. In this case, not referring to specifically low-income programs, is around 75%. And when you compare that to opt-in rates for the most successful green power programs, those are between 20 and 25% participation. So free opt-out audits for energy efficiency, for example, can be really effective for influencing customers to proceed with installs. One more interesting approach is to offer free services or add-on value to attract customers. So Posigen, for example, has some of the highest referral rates. They actually get 50% of their customers from word of mouth. And they have some of the lowest customer acquisition costs of any company in residential solar leasing. Posigen believes that one of the factors driving referrals is paired efficiency. They also offer free solar assessments and efficiency audits. Posigen's customers often live in older building stock with lower performing envelopes, which can translate to greater impact to energy costs and home comfort, even through relatively small upgrades. And they tell their neighbors. Thanks for staying with us up to this point. We know that that was a lot of pretty dense information, but information that we think is valuable. So I know we haven't gone through each of the models one by one, and that we've kind of thrown up various pieces of each model without giving the whole picture. As Karina mentioned earlier, Breaking Ground, our publication on our website, gives the full explanations of 4 of these models with complete diagrams. And also stay tuned for a follow-on publication and diagrams that we'll be publishing in the coming months. So in Breaking Ground, we identified the 4 main ways that we believe these models are adapting to serve low-income customers. These 4 pathways are a way to summarize all the innovations that we just walked through. We're going to call them transform, reorganize, aggregate, and diversify. So first, transform. They are transforming what we consider valuable. So this means that the models are finding unconventional sources of value and monetizing that value. As we talked about with the community solar models in Rochester and New Mexico, these sources of value can include existing social networks and community labor. They're reorganizing how stakeholders work with each other to enable new kinds of transactions and resource exchanges. We see this, for example, in Fort Collins, where the utility itself is actually piloting solar and efficiency offerings. They're aggregating many customers at once. This encourages economies of scale and other efficiencies to reduce costs. We see this most obviously through the community and multifamily solar models presented, though also in the tenant load flex model, which aggregates customers' heating loads to provide valuable load flexibility to the utility. Finally, they are diversifying, both on the customer side and the investor side, as Karina described. They include multiple customer types and different investors with different investment criteria, ultimately to manage and reduce risk. For example, Posigen showed us the usefulness of having a diverse capital stack. And the building co-op model shows us an example of aggregating customers of various income classes.
Okay. Well, before we go to Q&A, we'd like to conclude by sharing some takeaways from our team and what we're personally finding out about this innovation space. This is sort of the point where we wish we could all see your faces and see your facial expressions to see how this has landed and how helpful this has been. We hope it has been. Again, we will be publishing some documents if you'd like to understand in more detail how models are working. But in terms of our takeaways and what we'd like to share with you as sort of last remarks, first, the models we reviewed are not an exhaustive list by any means. We've learned about a number of very interesting models, and we'll be continuing to feed those through our research process and document them in the new year in 2017. But just a bit of a teaser, Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, who we've been in touch with, is working on 2 models that might be interesting to our listeners. One is a transportation ESCO that would provide efficient, clean, and right-sized mobility fleets for service organizations that work with low-income households, like those that provide food or healthcare. They're also crafting a model called SunShares, and part of how that works is to offer households access to community solar through employers. Grid Alternatives, whose single-family model we have brought up several times in this session, has been expanding their services to be able to serve multifamily households in states and other regions with other utility and regulatory design constraints. They have a few projects going on where they're working with munis, municipal utilities, and rural co-ops on local community solar models. Rural Renewable Energy Alliance is another interesting model. They're forging a concept that would enable families who today qualify and currently get energy bill assistance from the federal government to be able to get their power from solar instead of fossil fuels. So a bit of a teaser, those are some that are interesting to us, and we're going to continue and pursue documentation of those. But at the same time, while these kinds of projects are in progress, there aren't a lot of projects. We're seeing a large gap in terms of the support and help for champions in this low-income space, especially at the pre-venture and pre-pilot phase. And this phase is so critical. Not only is the variety of pilots and betas useful to teach this industry what works and what doesn't and why, but the results in these betas give us critical information about the quality of financial returns and insights like ways to screen customers besides credit scores and how to deliver more than lower costs, which are required for investors who could fund scaling. To that end, we're very interested in staying closely tuned to innovations that come out of organizations like Clean Energy Group, Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, Enterprise Community Partners, just to name a few, who are focusing on helping to bring concepts to demo. And we will continue to follow the DOE's Clean Energy for Low-Income Communities Accelerator to learn what emerges from that program. And starting in winter, we at our team will be putting our resources to partner with developing concepts using our eLab accelerator approach, and we'll give you more information about that and how to participate at the end of this webinar. Another takeaway, there isn't a lot of precedence for scaling models for low income that have very high uptake. You know, a lot of stakeholders in the sector are asking, how do we scale models? Well, some of them need to be piloted still for the first time in order for that precedence to occur. Of the models we have dived into, some are being implemented for the first time. But others, like the single-family grid and Posigen models, have been each served close to 8,000 households at this time. So we've talked to both those models about their major milestones and path to scaling. What did their first pilots look like? How did that compare to their most mature or recent projects to date? It's been interesting to get their very different perspectives on what has made that possible for each of them, one being an assistance model and the other being an enterprise for-profit business model. And we'll describe those insights in our next paper. And finally, what we call RMI's learning edge on this, in this low-income sector, our work and the questions that we face. These are questions that we are hoping to dive into in fuller detail in our work in 2017. First, how are models going to work across sector? So the total energy burden for low-income households includes electricity, heating, gas, mobility. How will the mixed models deliver cumulative savings in a way that feels simple and inexpensive to customers, but really takes care of customers' overarching energy use? And how might these models be related to the delivery of other utilities like broadband, for instance? How are we going to see partnerships with other industries to find complementary uses for land, like in agriculture, property, and other assets? And finally, sort of one of the barriers here, different energy assets provide different kinds of returns and revenues. So how can we harmonize these for new models? Second, how can we accelerate how can we really speed the deployment of renewables to low-income customers, but ensure that customers are also given time to meaningfully engage in the process, to give input and consider their priorities and needs? And we've boiled this question down to, do we have to go slow to go fast? We don't think so, and we're looking into ways that people are quickly generating input from communities. The third really is about the evolving distribution grid. So in our eLab work, many of you are on the phone, are part of these inquiries too, but we are, you know, we look ahead. What is the distribution system operator's role going to be in relation to low-income customers? What obligations will other DER providers have besides DSOs to low-income customers? And for those of you who've been working in the value of D, or let's say thinking about solar valuation beyond NEM, what are the benefits to low income that are going to come from any NEM successor and from the value of D? And how can low income customers participate? How is compensation method going to impact them? Given the emerging distribution vision, sort of one question that we have in our minds is, what is that balance between assistance-based and enterprise-based solutions that will provide ample and attractive clean energy opportunities for all?
Great. Thank you, Karina and Lauren, and thank you everyone for sticking with us. So we'd like to jump to some of the questions we've received. We've actually received quite a few. Some of the more detailed or kind of nuanced questions, if we don't get to them on the phone here, please feel free to send me a follow-up email after the webinar. My email address will be on the last slide. The first one is kind of a summary of actually many of the questions we received, maybe for Karina and Lauren to consider. How are these models coming about? Who is leading kind of the development of these models, and what's the process?
Okay, I'm just getting a little message that folks can't see the slides. So I just want to see if that makes things a little better while we address the question. Okay, sounds good. Thanks, guys. So that's a good question. Where are these models coming from? Who's leading them? What's the process? You know, that's a very interesting question. There's no formal place, just like a lot of other business models. They're hatching in various pockets. I would say, you know, in-house we think about 3 sources or champions that we're seeing beginning to self-sort. The first are community-based organizations. These folks know these customers the best. They understand what they need. They understand what the desires are, and even the extent and ability for low-income customers to participate quite openly and quite extensively within these choices. And so these folks are coming up with some great ideas about the interface and customer interface. And I would say their barriers they face are coaching, often on the legal and financial structure side. They are not necessarily entrepreneurs. They just have these ideas and these observations that they're trying to turn into working functions. The second are entrepreneurs. These folks in the clean energy sector, some of them have experience with low income, some of them have had experience in the clean energy sector and they're breaking into low income. And I would say that these folks have the kind of innovations they usually come with are around the service and the delivery service, and some of the unique contracting arrangements that can make things move quickly, and how and where to get funding. And the issues they face in bringing their model to market is, again, coaching specifically around low incomes and the specific low income hurdles and different constraints that we're seeing on a regulatory basis, especially in different geographies. And then the third, utilities and government. These are the folks who have the mandate to serve low income customers and have been doing so. And they are, as the distribution grid is changing, they're wondering as more options come online, as we're facing threats, as we're facing opportunities, how are we going to continue being able to serve low-income customers? And they're on the hook and under observation to do that. And so I'd say their challenge is changing or evolving their process to include some of the other low-income considerations that haven't always necessarily been part of the core design process. In terms of what the process is for bringing them to market, I would say different processes for different models. What we are looking for is to see more resources for coaching, incubators and accelerators that can really help mentor this crowd and provide them with resources that to date other inventors and innovators have had who are serving higher income customers.
Great, thanks. One question, what does opt-out mean? I know we mentioned that regarding some of the utility models, regarding utility partners.
Anyone, we can take that. So opt-out and opt-in. So this is essentially, I'll explain what we mean and then how it's been playing out as we see it. So opt-out literally means if you don't want to be in this program, you need to opt out. Otherwise, the default is you'll be enrolled in the program. Whereas opt-in means you won't be a part of this program unless you elect to enroll. And the idea is that people don't necessarily want to take the extra effort to call or to email or to communicate and say, take me off this list, and they get enrolled as part of a default. Now, how it doesn't mean that you're going to come home and find a solar panel on your roof. I mean, a lot of the things that we're talking about involve, like we said, real technology and installation of that. The opt-in components that we've been talking about have to do with opting in for, let's say, scheduling for an audit, opting in for someone showing up, coming to your door, expecting to have a certain list of standardized tasks be followed through in that engagement. So really, I think sometimes people get nervous when they hear that. They're like, well, how can we just automatically enroll people in a default mechanism that could cost quite a lot of money or can mean quite a bit in terms of what people are committing to? And really what we mean is opt in on that first step that leads you towards a broader program.
Great. What would allow these models to scale even faster? What are the main barriers?
Well, there are quite a few. I think there's, this is a discussion that we could have, I'm sure, with everyone on the phone. Sounds like there's 87 of you out there. And we could blow this out into a 5-day workshop session. So maybe what I could do is get a little selfish about what we're seeing as one of the major barriers and where we'd like to focus. And I hope that's okay for folks out there. And really, we talked about this a little bit before, but you know, I think there are some ways around the way regulations, policies, financing flows, and structures exist today that we can talk about, like I said, for days around how those could be evolved. And those are some of the fundamental changes that will enable scaling in the long run. In the short run, I would say that what we're seeing is some short-term barriers that are preventing models to even reach pilot in the first place. And the reason why I call attention to that is that if we're thinking about something broad in the long run, the kinds of investors we've been talking to that can really take that on, so whether they be banks or credit unions, really do require precedence of financial return and data and some really important proof points. And so to us, one of the barriers we see is simply the design and execution of pilot projects. When obviously pilot projects aren't going to be put out exactly the way the final rollout is. So some things might be automated in the final rollout, that's actually done back of house, but how can pilots be designed so that they provide adequate proof points for the next level of scaling? And we think partly through partnership with entities who may take scaling on in the future, and then also through coaching and some careful deliberation around strategies for those first pilots that simply cannot wait for regulatory or financial structures in order for them to start making a difference today.
Great, thank you, Karina. We actually have a lot more questions. Unfortunately, we haven't had time to get to today. Before we wrap up, I wanted to make a selfish eLab plug for an upcoming program, eLab Accelerator 2017. This is what we call a boot camp for innovation. We really provide a facilitated space for accelerating projects and project teams, getting done in the span of 4 days what might take 6 months to 1 year. So it's a really exciting opportunity for folks. In particular, we provide structured facilitated working sessions, tools and training to conceptualize problems, facilitation, really leverage new alliances to form a broader support network, and then also a really unique working environment. Anyway, I can't recommend the program enough. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see our 2017 Accelerator project themes that we recruit for. The new business models, DER value creation, microgrids, and more. The last thing I'll say is stay tuned. So as Karina mentioned and Lauren, a lot of this content is pretty dense, and we've shown you just some kind of tidbits from many of our drawings. You'll be able to find those designs and drawing packages and also our upcoming insight brief on our website, linked here on the slide. And then also, please do feel free to reach out to myself and Karina in particular if we didn't get to your questions or if you wanted more information. Finally, we'll be providing this webinar tomorrow through the New York Low Income Forum on Energy. So spoiler alert, it's really similar to this one. So if you're already registered for that, it might look the same. But also feel free to recommend any of your friends or colleagues that you might think this could be relevant for. And again, the link is there on the slide. So with that, we'd really like to thank you for your time and attendance today. And we look forward to connecting with many of you soon. Thank you.